So I just wanted to start by thanking my hosts for giving me this invitation to this fantastic event. As an ex-Catholic, I thought I was barred from paradise, but this is an earthly paradise. And even if it's not immortal, it's wonderful to be here. So thank you so much. This is going to be a very brief history of immortality in the afterlife, which in its democratic form, certainly, is a surprisingly late development. Woody Allen, who I'm not that keen on, but I do love that remark, which is, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. So it's sort of an answer to Ray, which is no, there's no consolation for the fact that we're going to die, even though it's something that, of course, all of us, we all want more of life. And over the centuries, we've found different ways to console ourselves for our mortality through art, fame, family. But, as Woody Allen points out, it's never quite enough. What we want is personal immortality. I think we've been grappling with death since humanity, that is, since society began. So if we go back to the earliest piece of literature that we know of, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written about 2100 BC, the lesson that the eponymous hero Gilgamesh has to learn is precisely that we have to die. And the goddess Chidori tells him, when the gods created mankind, death they dispensed to mankind, life they kept for themselves. He, in fact, progresses from refusal of death to acceptance of death, to recognition of its inevitability, and finally to a view of how to live a good life in its shadow. In the process, he goes from tyrant to human, and finally to civilized king. Fear of death, acceptance of mortality, and the humanizing and civilizing process go hand in hand, and that's the profound insight of the epic. So just very briefly, Gilgamesh is a noble warrior king, but he's a tyrannical one, whom the gods decide he must be taught how to rule justly. And they create Enkidu to be his counselor, who's a child of nature and is brought up with gazelles, runs with gazelles, and so on. Enkidu meets Gilgamesh. They become firm friends and fellow warriors who set off on sort of adventures together. But in their hubris, they insult the goddess Ishtar, who decides to punish just one of them, Enkidu, who falls mortally ill. Gilgamesh is inconsolable at the death of his friend and refuses to accept it and fears for his own death and sets off on a quest to find the secret of immortality, which he does. He finds the plant of immortality, but it's stolen by a serpent who lurked in Mesopotamia's Garden of Eden, just as it did 1,500 years later in the blissful Garden of Genesis. So Gilgamesh learns that immortality exists, but that it's not for humans. And the goddess Chidori tells him, "Let your belly be full, enjoy yourself always by day and by night. Make merry each day, dance and play day and night." Now this, if I can get to it, is, if you have the time to read that, it's almost exactly replicated by Ecclesiastes, much, much later in time. And the book of Genesis, in fact, is heavily based on the Epic of Gilgamesh. But her advice is not a solitary hedonism. It's thanks to the love he had for Enkidu that Gilgamesh has been humanized and civilized and learns to love and care for his subjects. He has moved from being an individual, exercising his Dwadasan year on young virginal brides, to being a person connected to his community. Returning from what he now recognizes was a fruitless quest for immortality, he now looks with satisfaction on the city walls he had had rebuilt to protect his subjects. He would not live on, but his walls would, and thanks to the security they provided, his people, his community would live on. So his city walls will live on. This is sort of very much following on from Pasquale. His city walls would live on, and through them, so would he. It was in the knowledge and acceptance of mortality that Gilgamesh learned to concentrate on improving this life. The compensation for death is civilization. He came a long way, was weary, found peace, says the epic. It's a sort of beyond, though, as Woody Allen says, it's not as good as the real thing. And the ancient world, interestingly, almost universally seems to have accepted that immortality, at least blissful immortality, was reserved for a very privileged few, for the gods themselves, for the semi-divine, and that, of course, included divine earthly rulers, like Pharaoh, who he could extend the privilege of immortality to his elite. Warriors too could be part of the privileged elite who made it to paradise. And this immortality, of course, had absolutely nothing to do with morality, with good or bad behaviour. It was solely a question of status. And it was a very physical world. So this eternal world had, for the Egyptians, it had pastries, which were their favourite delicacy. Much later, for the Islamic, very physical paradise, it's got lots of sex, lots of wine, and it's very much sort of geared to heterosexual men, but it's very physical. But although there is this immortality for a very few privileged people or gods, most ancient cultures know that, and resolutely accept, in fact, that for the majority of humanity, there was a sort of life after death, but it was an immortality devoutly not to be wished for. Neither the Mesopotamians, the Chinese, the early Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans seem to have had any illusions about what happened after death. Anything really is preferable to that shadowy, dreary half-life. Hades is where the living dead are sad, impotent shadows, squeaking like bats in the gloom. And every underworld, in fact, was a place of shadows and darkness. The Jews similarly showed no interest in personal immortality, judging by the total absence of references to it in the Torah, which was written around the 8th century BC. They had their Hades, their Sheol, but no heaven or hell. Only God and celestial beings eat of the tree of life and live forever. And the writers of the book of Job, which was probably written in about the 6th century BC, are equally uninterested in personal immortality. Poor old faithful Job is never offered the consolation that he will be recompensed in the next world for the sufferings God forces him to endure in this. The dead, Job proclaims, shall not awake nor be raised out of their sleep. And the authors of Ecclesiastes, which was probably written around the 5th to the 2nd century BC, echo the epic of Gilgamesh and counsel, as we've seen, to place their value on this life, not on thinking about the next life. But if there was a consolation, it's what Yahweh offers Abraham, which is permanence through the continuity of the group, the family, the tribe. I will protect your descendants, he says, the founders of nations. Abraham may die, but Isaac, Ishmael, and their descendants will found nations, and those nations will be peopled with his progeny. In fact, it's very similar promise to what Dawkins' religion of evolution has to offer. Abraham's selfish gene is promised immortality. Now, the Greeks and the Romans were equally convinced that they too would live on through their descendants, but they also believed that some of them would live on through something totally immaterial, their good name. And that good name would be preserved by art in songs and poems. It is thanks to Homer's art that I did not die, says Achilles, that Patroclus is mine, that my Ajax is equal to the immortals, that Troy gained glory and did not fall. It is through art that time present, time past, and to come are conjoined, that Achilles has both died a warrior's death and yet perpetually lives. It is permanence of a new sort, not offered to Abraham or Gilgamesh. It is the permanence of a place in a poem. And it's no coincidence to me, and it's something, of course, that the epic of Gilgamesh has pointed out already, of the connection between death and civilization, that the god of the underworld is often associated with civilization. Gilgamesh himself was the restorer of social and religious order after the flood, rebuilding temples, wells, and mountain passes, as well as being god of the underworld. Orpheus and his prototype, the Egyptian god Osiris, are both gods of the underworld and gods of music and song, the inventors of agriculture and viniculture. Woody Allen is convinced that permanence through fame is no compensation for the loss of being alive in the world. And for the Greeks and Romans, that was also always a question. It's the question that Achilles' divine mother, the silver-footed Thetis, puts to him, which is, remain here and fight at the siege of Troy, forgo all homecoming, yet win endless renown, or sail home to my native land, lose fame and glory, but live a long life, and be spared an early end. But of course he's also well aware that nothing can recall a man's spirit once the breath has left his lips. And he, of course, finally plumps for the fame, but once he's in Hades, he regrets that choice. I would rather be a slave toiling in the land of the living than be king of the shades in Hades, he tells Odysseus, when Odysseus is a visitor from the living world, congratulates him on his continuing fame and on his rule in the underworld. It's only when Odysseus tells his comrade that he can be proud of his son, who has followed in his father's footsteps and become a valiant warrior, that Achilles' gloom lifts, and he leaves Odysseus taking long strides across the asphodel meadow, a sort of a wonderfully poignant image of sort of heroic acceptance of death. Odysseus, of course, makes the opposite choice. He chooses homecoming, and rather than accepting the beautiful goddess Calypso's offer of a sip of ambrosia, he prefers the mortal life. He wants to see his dog, his son, and his wife. He wants real material permanence, not the intangibles of fame conveyed through art, or even the immortality of the gods. So far in this very brief, crude story, the non-immortals of the ancient world, that is the humans, looked for the consolation of permanence by living on through their descendants, the work they left behind, or their place in the epics written about them. It's not until the late 5th, 4th century BC that the Greeks begin to believe in immortality, and not just for the very privileged few. It entails for Plato the total severance of soul and body. The body rots and dies, but the soul can live forever. Though it's the prolongation of life rather than another world life, because the soul needs another body in which to live on. According to Diotima, priestess-philosopher, recalled by Socrates in Plato's Symposium, we satisfy our desire for immortality by creating, quote, by always leaving a successor to replace what decays. That creation is either in the physical form of children or in the mental form of thought and all other human excellence. Now, although Diotima likens the creators of mind children to the creators of real children, she is in no doubt that the creations of the mind are far finer. More than that, through their mind children, creators can gain immortality by attaining true knowledge, the knowledge of beauty and goodness. But that knowledge, and apologies, by the way, to Platonists, because this is, I realise this is very crude, but that our knowledge of truth cannot be attained by our senses alone, because this world is illusory, ever-changing and ever-decaying. The seeker of truth must embark on a journey of knowledge, a journey, in fact, up the ladder of love, progressing from knowledge of the particular instances of beauty until he contemplates the form, beauty, goodness, the immutable, unchanging idea which finds its imperfect instantiations in the ever-changing, ever-decaying world. This journey earns the seeker after truth, quote, the friendship of the gods, and that makes him, if anyone, immortal. But note that Diotima is still slightly sceptical with that, if anyone. But in comparison, the physical creations, the children of flesh and bones, have been left far behind. They have no value. The merely material and the homely pales into insignificance in comparison with this spiritual summum available to those who aren't bought off by Yahweh's promise to Abraham. In the Iliad, Achilles had achieved immortality, or at least permanence, through his own foam and its replication in his child. For Diotima, only the acquisition of truth confers immortality. So they obviously introduce an important and potentially fatal turn in the yearning for permanence. Gilgamesh, Abraham, Achilles, and Odysseus are all lovers of life. They want more of it, like Woody Allen. But they believe that the soul of every human is immortal, or at least that it can live forever. But that prospect is bought at a great cost. It requires the severing of the soul from the body. The living, breathing, material world becomes something to be distrusted, despised, rejected. Truth and reality lie beyond it. The body, as part of the material world, corrupts and rots. The spirit is imprisoned within it and contaminated by it, and must be free of the body in order to soar to the truth. The tree of eternal life is the same as the tree of knowledge in this Platonic conception, which, of course, it's not in the Garden of Eden, where they're very distinctly two trees. But the huge cost is that you have to give up a belief in the value of living in this world to eat from its fruit. So Diotima answers Woody Allen by denigrating what he wants. Don't mourn the loss of this life, because it's not worth much anyway. And this conception turns the ancients' conception, on its head of the relative value of life and death. The ancients valued this life and knew that the immortality that was mankind's lot was far less desirable. Shadowy half-life was to be shunned at all costs. The Platonic view makes the living world a half-life. Life becomes a preparation for death. But of course, this denigration of this world is very appealing to those who find that this world is an ordeal. It's why the primacy of this world presents far less of a problem for the elite, for whom it is on the whole satisfactory, cushioned as they are from the bitterness of life by wealth and status. The aristocratic Sadducees, for instance, had no use for personal immortality. Even though in the 1st century BC, the Pharisees, the populists of Judaism, who were trying to wrest control of Judaism away from the Sadducees, introduced the idea of personal immortality. And they do that partly because of the Platonic division of the perishable body and the spiritual eternal soul, but more importantly, because the Jews are despairing at the might of the Roman Empire. Rome's control of Palestine, confirmed by the disastrous Jewish revolt, which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 AD, seemed to be fatally undermining God's promise that the Jews' homeland would be restored to them. The disappointment of lived reality led the Pharisees to develop a theology of personal salvation after death. There was a realm in which Yahweh would make things good again. But it's important to emphasize that, of course, that although there is this strand of personal immortality in Judaism, it's really a very minor one, and that far more important then as now is Yahweh's promise to the whole community. Judaism is much more focused on this life than on any preparation for another life. The Christians, under Paul's leadership, followed the Platonic line. Life was to be lived in preparation for the next world. Paul, in fact, expected that the world would end in his lifetime. He never did live to see the end of the world, and Christians slowly relinquished the conviction that it would happen any day soon. But the Pauline tradition, inherited from Plato, of denigrating the material world and therefore all things bodily, especially the sexual, the male disgust for woman, the cesspool into which men fall, as one early Christian father put it, that disgust with the physical continued and does so to this day. And as I've mentioned, Islam is refreshingly physical by contrast, because it has none of the Platonic suspicion and later Christian disgust with the physical, which we just talked about. In fact, Islam believes that the material world as God's creation is perfect. There is no original sin. Once we have all submitted to Allah, this world will achieve perfection. So, of course, it's a wonderful democratic equalizing idea, the idea of personal immortality. The problem with it is that it's also a recipe for political quiescence. Diotima's denigration of the life that we live and make. From that, it's a small step to go from, if this life disappoints, don't worry, there is something better, to, now that you believe that there is something better for you, you won't rebel if this life disappoints. This is the sense in which Marx argues that the Church of Christ, by being, quote, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions, actually prevents the improvement of life. Consolation becomes a management task for elites, a way of creating quiescent subjects. Marx's programme, of course, became the programme of the 19th and 20th centuries, which is, rather than place the ideal in an imaginary afterlife, place it in this world, which we can not only build for our descendants, but actually inhabit ourselves. It gives us National Health Service's huge scientific efforts to prolong life, going all the way to Silicon Valley's Methuselah Project, which I'm sure I'd love to ask Daniel about, whose faithful believe that the first human to live to 500 years old has already been born. It looks increasingly possible that we can massively extend the duration of our lives. But we in the secular world have given up on the idea of an afterlife. This world is all we've got. So now that we've lost our belief in the afterlife, are we reverting back to the ancients' view that in face of death, we must all the more relish this life and try to improve this world rather than preparing ourselves for some other world? The problem, and I've almost finished, the problem for us secular Westerners is that we are no longer innocent. We've been corrupted by Platonized Christianity, by the idea of an eternal bliss, so blissful it was virtually indescribable, and one that could be available to everyone. We are now trying to create that vision on Earth, but inevitably it will fall short. Consumer goods are available to just about everyone, but of course they can't give us the permanent satisfaction of the ineffable. We want to eat of the tree of happiness as well as of the trees of immortality and knowledge of good and evil. Inevitably, we are disillusioned with our earthly paradise, and our resultant dissatisfaction will naturally contribute to the nihilism that always lurks on the edge of our awareness of our mortality. So we flout our knowledge of the transience of our life. It is clear in the emphasis art now puts on the ephemeral, a mocking of the immortal, of the permanent too. The artwork is made to be eaten, to decay. It is, some might think, as heroic as the epitaph with which so many Romans stuck their thumbs up at death. I was not, I am not, I care not. But it's a sort of kind of childish sticking your thumbs up, as if to a God, though we now know that he doesn't exist. So it's slightly petulant and childish, as I say. We have travelled many dead ends since Enkidu was sent by the gods to civilize us. Perhaps we late Mesopotamians now need to relearn to love this world with its materiality and for its very transience. Thank you.